graphic novels this year was Lunar New Year Love Story by Gene Luen Yang. He is one of my favorite graphic novel artists and writers. This is about a girl named Val who feels like she's never going to be lucky in love, and then she meets someone at a dragon dancing demonstration during Lunar New Year. I really liked the illustrations. There's like a lot of gray out when she's feeling kind of lost, but there's a lot of color when she's starting to feel things come to life. There's some family drama that she's able to confront, but also making new friends and learning new skills. So it's really great for young adults who are going through changes, and also if you love really bright, fun illustrations, this is a great story for you. Okay.
I would love to recommend a book called The Bullet Swallower by Elizabeth Gonzalez James. It's a historical adventure western with a sprinkle of magical realism in it. And this book takes place in two different timelines. In 1965, we have Jamie Sonoro, who finds a book that supposedly tells his family's history, including some atrocious crimes committed by his ancestors and the curse that resulted from those actions. And as the shadowy figure that has haunted his family for generations shows up and starts stalking him and his young son, he realizes he needs to know more about the story of his grandfather, Antonio. And then on the other timeline, we have Antonio in 1895. And Antonio Sonoro is the notorious bandit known as the Bullet Swallower, who pledged revenge against the Texas Rangers after they killed his brother. He is shot, hanged, strangled, left for dead, but doesn't die. And rumor has it, still walks the earth carrying the Sonoro family curse into the present day. This book is lots of fun, big adventures, grand history. If you love family sagas, you'll love this one.
The first book I'd like to talk about is The Night Guest by Hildur Knutsdóttir. Knutsdóttir is an Icelandic author who has written several works. This is the first in English that's been translated into English. And it follows Ithun, who is a young woman who is waking up every morning feeling completely unrested and growing more and more fatigued, and her waking days are starting to fall apart because of it. Doctors can't explain it. She seems perfectly healthy. Then one night she falls asleep with her fitness watch on, and she wakes up the next morning smelling of the sea and somehow clocking over 40,000 steps. Thus starts her kind of slow descent into madness. It might be supernatural, it might not be, you don't know, as kind of her waking and nocturnal lives kind of come together in a horrific and psychologically terrifying sort of way. Knutsdóttir writes in this very kind of straightforward, sparse style that actually gets even more sparse as the story goes on, which really heightens this feeling of being disconnected and discombobulated and disoriented like the Ithun is in the book. And it all kind of comes crashing together in a somewhat ambiguous but kind of darkly terrifying, creepy way that, like I said, really had me read the whole thing in pretty much one sitting. So if you're looking to really creep yourself out for like an afternoon, pick up The Night Guest.
In 2024, I'd say the book that I enjoyed the most was Erik Larson's Demon of Unrest. It's a book that I've recommended to people that I've talked to about it. Erik Larson is a writer who sort of writes about historical events in a novelized sort of way. And I don't mean that he fictionalizes it. I think that he just has a talent for writing about nonfiction and historical events in a way that almost makes them read like a novel. The Demon of Unrest is about the intrigue that led up to the firing on Fort Sumter, the Fort Sumter incident being the beginning of the incident that started the American Civil War. And what I liked about it so very much was that so much of it centers on the experience of the commander of that fort at Fort Sumter. His last name was Anderson, and it's made clear as you read that this poor guy was stuck in a situation where he wasn't getting clear orders from anyone. He was put in a situation where he was at certain points begging the White House under Buchanan, who was the president who immediately preceded Lincoln. What am I supposed to do about this? The Charleston, the people of Charleston don't want us here. They're putting more and more cannons around us. my men are in a certain amount of danger. This fort's not done being constructed. What do you want us to do? And the Buchanan administration was sort of paralyzed by disbelief by what was going on. I think that they were so surprised that the South was serious about what was going on, that they almost couldn't figure out what to do. And I really sympathized a lot with Anderson as just being somebody who's trying to do the right thing, trying to do their duty, while around him they're telling this. There's a parallel story of this guy by the name of Ruffin, Edmund Ruffin, who was what they call a fire eater secessionist, who was literally going around on like an evangelical tour of the South, trying to convince people not only that secession is right, but that if we got to go to war to kill people over this, that we should do it. And so it sort of shows the different sorts of inaction or fanaticism that can inform these heated political and historical moments in the history of the country. That when you come up through the education system in the United States, it's very often the particular personalities and the particular viewpoints can sometimes be downplayed in favor of these huge historical forces. And what Erik Larson does in this book is make clear there's sometimes just one or two people who make these decisions or don't make decisions that lead to enormous conflagrations. I think that it could almost be argued that the mishandling or the wait and see attitude of the Buchanan administration basically led to the deaths of 600,000 Americans in a civil war. And I think that he's not express about that. It's subtle, but that's one of the things that I liked about the book, is that it made clear that decisiveness, indecisiveness, not being able to figure out the right thing to do, argumentativeness can have real world consequences that can be conflagrations.
So first I want to recommend Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands. This is book 2 to the Emily Wilde series. The first book came out beginning of 2023. This came out beginning of 2024. It is cozy, fantasy, romance, perfect winter vibes, especially as we're coming up into warmer weather. We have Emily Wilde, a researcher of fairies, going to the Swiss Alps in order to create the first map of the other lands, of the realm of the fairies. And shenanigans ensue. I very much recommend this. This is such a fun series.
The spookiest book I've read this year was called The Reformatory by Tananarive Due. We have a wonderful librarian here who has a million different horror books for me to read, and this one was a standout. And I loved it so much because it's a historical book as well as fiction taking place in the Jim Crow South at a place called the Reformatory. Robbie Stevens has to go to the Reformatory after defending his sister against a white man, and there's a lot of secrets. And at this reformatory, he can actually see the ghosts of the kids who have passed. And it's actually based on a real place called the Dozier School for Boys in Florida that closed in the early 2000s. And this one was just really good because Southern horror is a little bit different than what we usually read in the North. And I really, really like the story, the social justice, and also just learning a little bit more about history we don't hear a lot about.
The Atropine Tree by Sarah Reed. This is the latest novel from our very own Reader's Advisory librarian, Sarah Reed. If you haven't heard, Sarah is a horror author with several published books to her name. We own all of them, and you should go check them out. This book in particular blends Victorian spiritualist lore, period-accurate medical science, and several time-honored Gothic literature traditions into a delightfully ghastly narrative. We open at the ancient manor house of the Aldane family, as Ulrich, the better-loved younger son, learns that his late father's will was not altered as expected, and so his brutish older half-brother has inherited everything. Despite this monumental disappointment, Ulrich believes he must do the best he can for those who are under his care. One of the many reasons I found this book so compelling was the depths of compassion our main character Ulrich demonstrates. He treats everyone around him with respect, even the silent, slightly unsettling child servants of the manor. These are the scratchlings, orphans taken from workhouses and experimented on by the Aldane family's resident alchemist, an older uncle. A large part of the body horror in this novel can be directly attributed to his medical laboratory. There is also a half-sister, Nelda, who I adore a great deal. While she's seemingly erratic in her mannerisms, Nelda has a wealth of knowledge on plants and their natural poisons. Unfortunately, she mostly uses this skill to poison herself and then, revive. Nelda is an avid spiritualist and claims that these toxic tinctures help her connect with the Aldane Manor's long-dead mistresses. Alric has to balance his beastly brother's behavior, his own safety, Nelda's safety, his uncle's experiments, and the well-being of the scratchlings, which is way too much for any one person to have to deal with, so it's really no surprise when that balance all comes crashing down. The fallout of what happens at Aldane Manor is of interest to far more than just the living.
Lula Dean's Little Library of Banned Books by Kristen Miller is a satirical novel set in a southern town and concerns a pitched battle over banned books. This is something very familiar to all librarians in the last couple of years, so I was kind of drawn to this book. It centers around Lula Dean, who is an empty nester, is kind of lonely and kind of looking for attention, and finds a purpose in life in banning books that she feels are inappropriate for the children and youth of her small town. She takes this one step further by creating a little library in front of her house that she stocks full of the books that she feels are appropriate. Books like The Southern Belle's Guide to Etiquette, instead of Toni Morrison's Beloved or The Diary of Anne Frank. Her nemesis in this is Beverly, a school board member who is vehemently opposed to the book bans, and Beverly's daughter, who secretly one night switches out all of Lula Dean's nice books for the banned books, given the old slide the banned book under the dust jacket cover. And so the book follows different people in the town as they pick up the books, thinking it's one thing and then ending up being exposed to a story completely different than they were expecting, and how that kind of changes their lives for the better. This could have been a much darker tale, but Miller goes for a very satirical novel, kind of with archetypal characters, and it ends in kind of a pitched battle for the mayor's office between Beverly and Lula Dean. And I'm not going to spoil it necessarily, but let's say it's just a nice warm blanket where good people have good things happen to them. People read books and are changed for the better, and kind of holier-than-thou hypocrites kind of get their comeuppance in embarrassing ways.
And then I have I Was a Teenage Slasher by Stephen Graham Jones. This is a very meta horror series, or not series, novel. Horror novel where Tolly Driver and his friend Amber, outcasts in their little town of Texas, have a run-in with a slasher, a formerly deceased classmate. And after that rampage, Tolly finds that he is maybe being influenced by this slasher entity. It's very fun, very moving, very gory. If you like slasher movies, you'll probably enjoy this. And I will say, when I went up on a trip to northern Wisconsin to a cabin in the woods, I may or may not have started this and then had a nightmare that night and woke up screaming. So if that's not a recommendation, I don't know what is.
One of my great reads this year is How to Solve Your Own Murder by Kristen Perrin, and that is a cozy mystery comedy with dual timelines. In the first one, it's 1965, and Frances Adams goes to a county fair where a fortune teller tells her that she will be murdered someday. And then she spends the next 6 decades of her life trying to solve a crime that hasn't happened yet and prevent her own murder. But it doesn't work, and she is, in fact, murdered. And in the other timeline, her great-niece, Annie, has come to town and is determined to solve this murder. But as she digs around, she realizes that her great-aunt just made everyone really angry all the time, digging into their secrets, trying to solve a murder that hadn't happened. And so everyone pretty much is a suspect. And as Annie gets closer to the truth, it looks like maybe she might inherit her fate instead of her fortune. But it's really good. There's a lot of funny moments. a little bit of tension, but it's mostly cozy, and I highly recommend it.
My latest favorite read was called When Sleeping Girls Lie. This features a young girl named Sade who was formerly homeschooled, and she has a lot of flashbacks to her childhood. As you read this story, a lot of horrors unfold at this new school that she's going to. It's a private school. There's a lot of privilege, and she seems to be on a mission that slowly unfolds. It's definitely a slow burn read. And I really, really enjoyed it. I like dark academia, and this takes place in that sort of setting, but it is a book for teens, so it's a great way to introduce teens to dark academia. So highly recommend that book as well. I don't know. I stayed up till midnight reading it, so if that's any indication, it was really wonderful.
For fans of TV and TV history, specifically reality TV, and you can admit it, we all watch something near reality TV. I'm recommending Cue the Sun, The Invention of Reality TV by Emily Nussbaum. Nussbaum takes a deep dive into the people, trends, and pop culture relevance of reality television, which is generally written off as disposable, gutter trash of entertainment. So I kind of believe that reality TV started in the 90s with The Real World. Nussbaum goes way back to the 1940s and early candid radio programs and prank shows that existed way before I thought they existed. The earliest being something called Candid Microphone, which was a prank radio show that eventually became Candid Camera, which I think a lot of people know. She looks in some of the early kind of reality TV shows with real people and real experiences. And if you thought some of the reality shows of today were kind of ew and gross, you should check out some of the ones that existed back in the 60s. Nussbaum is really adept at pulling meaning from what is considered, lowbrow TV. And yes, there's a lot of kind of shady characters and ugliness and exploitativeness to this, but she also points out that it exposed America to certain groups of people that who would never have seen before. Big long chapter on Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, which if you remember that from the late 90s, early 2000s, you couldn't escape that and had a massive impact on people's understanding of gay culture. Ultimately, this is an incredibly detailed history filled with fascinating characters, some horrifying storylines, some uplifting storylines, kind of no stone goes unturned. And she takes the history from those 1940s all the way up to the early 2000s and, the boom with like Survivor and The Bachelor and Joe Millionaire and all these kind of shows that I remember sadly watching.
Finally, I want to recommend Bury Your Gaze by Chuck Tingle. I do not have the book on hand, but it is about a writer of horror movies and television within Hollywood. He is somewhat closeted in a relationship with his long-term boyfriend, and with his horror sci-fi series that he was writing, his bosses want him to kill off his main characters once they reveal they are in love, two women together. When he refuses to do that, all of his past monsters that he created start coming after him, and he has to figure out why and what this has to do with his gay women in a relationship. It is so good. It is funny, aware of horror movies in Hollywood, aware of the status of the LGBTQ community within Hollywood, both as money-making horses within the business, as well as not really wanting them to be around. It's good. It's also very sweet. The romance between the main character and his boyfriend is sweet. He's got a very good group of friends who may or may not be in danger because of his creations. Is such a good book. Highly recommend.